Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Warren Harding, and the focus is disarmament. The year was 1921. It's about 6 months into Harding's term as president. And look, he had focused mostly on domestic issues right out of the gate, but there were some international things going on as well. He had negotiated final peace treaties separately with Germany and the other Central Powers because, of course, the U.S. had rejected the Treaty of Versailles, including the League of Nations covenant that had been so important to Woodrow Wilson, but was unacceptable to the U.S. Senate. But Warren Harding was not a complete isolationist. In fact, he believed the U.S. could play a lead role in international affairs, and he was actually about to teach his predecessor a lesson on how to get things done in the U.S. system of government, because he was about to negotiate the most significant disarmament treaty in the history of the world to date. This idea did not start with Warren Harding. In fact, during the last couple of years of the Wilson administration, Senator William Borah had put forward a couple of proposals to stop building naval vessels for a period of 6 months, call Britain and Japan, the other leading navies of the world, together with the United States, and come up with some sort of a disarmament plan. Now, this did not pass. Borah's suggestion did not pass under the Wilson administration, but Charles Evans Hughes, the new Secretary of State, liked these ideas, and he and Warren Harding were aligned. Maybe there's something to it, and the U.S. should take the lead. So the Harding administration sent out invitations to a conference in Washington, D.C. to talk disarmament. But it wasn't just to Great Britain and to Japan. Also invited France and Italy, along with China and Belgium and the Netherlands and Portugal. All of these 9 countries coming together, the 8 plus the United States. It was well received. They're all coming, and they were going to start on Armistice Day, November the 11th, 1921. But they decided to delay by 1 day because something else was happening that day: the dedication of the tomb of the unknown soldier. The remains of this soldier had been exhumed from the Romagne military cemetery in France, brought over to the United States on a ship, brought to the U.S. Capitol where the remains lay in state. Warren Harding going and paying his respects to this unknown soldier. And the same catafalque that Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, and William McKinley, the 3 slain U.S. presidents, had sat in when they lay in state in the U.S. Capitol. Now that honor was given to this unknown soldier. President Harding and John Pershing, the general from World War I, then escorted the body side by side on its way back to the White House, where it eventually then continued the procession off to Arlington National Cemetery. This was a somber event that Warren Harding presided over, and he said that as we return this poor clay to its mother's soil, garlanded by love and covered with the decorations that only nations can bestow, I can sense the prayers of our people, of all peoples, that this Armistice Day shall mark the beginning of a new and lasting era of peace on earth, goodwill among men. A great lead-in for the conference that would start the very next day. Well, Warren Harding took a very different perspective to his conference than Woodrow Wilson had taken the previous couple of years when he went over to Paris for the peace conference to try to bring World War I to an end. First of all, Harding was not going to lead this delegation himself. He would give the welcome address, he would come back at the end, but he was going to get out of the way and let other delegates actually do the work. In his welcoming address, though, this was very well received. He set that tone to the delegates where he said, I can speak officially only for the United States. Our 100 millions frankly want less of armament and none of war. Wholly free from guile, sure in our own minds that we harbor no unworthy designs, we accredit the world with the same good intent. So I welcome you, not alone in goodwill and with high purpose, but with high faith. This was a nice start. He would get out of the way. There were handshakes, slaps on the back. Everybody was pleased as Harding then turned things over to Charles Evans Hughes, who shocked a whole bunch of folks because the United States had actually kind of held its ideas close to the vest prior to the conference, and now Hughes told them he was recommending no more capital shipbuilding for navies in any of these countries for the next 10 years. And he wasn't done. He suggested that the leading powers, particularly the United States, Britain, and Japan, would actually scrap a bunch of their existing fleets to get down to a ratio in tonnage of 5 to 5 to 3. The US and Britain at the highest at 5, and a ratio of 3 to Japan, and then Italy and France would be next at about half of where Japan was. Well, everyone recessed, and this was kind of a stunning opening. Colonel Charles Repington of the British delegation said Secretary Hughes sunk in 35 minutes more ships than all the admirals of the world have sunk in a cycle of centuries. The question is, Would they go along? Well, the delegations came back a couple of days later, and one by one, they offered their support for these discussions, including France, where Premier Aristide said that therefore, having won the war together, we for ourselves cannot remain deaf to the eloquent appeal that was addressed to us in order to win peace together. If the necessary precautions are taken in order to ensure her life and safety, France, like you gentlemen, is ready to say down arms. It was a big moment because France was, of course, right next to Germany still and still worried about what might happen there. One by one, Japan and the others followed. There seemed to be some support for this. Now, this was a real opportunity, but there would be differences, and it would be 12 weeks of negotiations in the United States, back and forth. The naval agreements largely held from what Hughes had put on the table. There were also some negotiations about land-based armaments and weapons destruction or elimination. France wasn't going to go along with this. They were still too worried about Germany, whose own munitions were brought way down in the Treaty of Versailles, but they were worried that Germany would repudiate that and come after them. So there were not going to be much agreements in terms of land-based disarmament, and also not much on submarines. They were still concerned about that. But surface ships, yes, agreements in place to bring those numbers down and stop the capital ship development for a period of 10 years. But there was actually more going on here because there were conflicts in the Pacific with Japan, China, and others that were settled at this conference. First of all, everyone agreed at the conference that the open door policy to China would continue. There would be equal access to all members of the global economy in terms of dealing economically with China. Importantly, Japan made an agreement, a concession, to return the Shantung province back to China. This had been very controversial during the peace conference in Paris and the Treaty of Versailles. A lot of countries, including many Americans, were against the decision that Woodrow Wilson agreed to allow Japan take over the Shantung province, which is really on the east coast of China. Japan agreed to give it back. There was also another treaty that came out of this, a four-power pact between the United States, Britain, France, and Japan to respect the territorial rights of each other in the Pacific and agree to a joint conference to settle any disputes. So a number of treaties were coming out of this conference in the United States. Really changed the landscape for global relations, massive reduction of naval armaments, and frankly save money, save billions of dollars, and perhaps also lower the tensions. These were not permanent agreements. They were all in the nature of about 10 to 15 years, but everyone felt like this was a major success. Now, Warren Harding was not in the room for most of these negotiations. That was by design, but he was monitoring things every step of the way with his Secretary of State, Hughes, and he came back at the end of the conference to close with some remarks. It is hazardous sometimes to speak in superlatives, but the result is so fine, so gratifying, so reassuring, so full of promise that above the murmurings of a world sorrow not yet silent, above the disagreements of a world struggling to find itself after surpassing upheaval, there is the note of rejoicing, which is not alone ours or yours or all of us, but comes from the hearts of men of all the world. This was a big deal to the people in the room and to those countries back home as well. Now, the work was not done, of course, because he still had to get this treaty approved by the United States Senate. And this is again where Warren Harding was very different from his predecessor. The Treaty of Versailles never passed, that Wilson had negotiated, never passed the United States Senate when it was voted on not once but twice. The League of Nations was up and running, but the United States was not part of it. Would Harding's treaties face the same fate? Well, he knew the importance of getting senatorial approval. He said that the success or failure of this administration depends on the ratification of these treaties. Every administration's name rests on one or two acts. If these treaties are ratified by the Senate, then this administration's name is secure in history. If the treaties are defeated, nothing I can do in the balance of my term will be of more than passing interest. So what did he do to get his treaties passed that Woodrow Wilson didn't do? Well, he frankly bested the political science PhD who had been his predecessor on how to get things done in the U.S. system of government. Again, Charles Evans Hughes was leading the American delegation, but who he picked to be on that delegation really mattered. Henry Cabot Lodge, the chair of foreign relations in the Senate, he was on it. Elihu Root, who was an internationalist Republican and had a lot of respect in the Republican Party, but also in government in general, he was a member of this contingent, as was Oscar Underwood. And this was the key role that Woodrow Wilson had rejected, bringing a senator from the opposition party onto the delegation itself, because Underwood was the Senate Minority Leader, the ranking Democrat on foreign relations, and to bring him and Lodge in together to work on this treaty from the very beginning in the negotiations actually really spurred the help to get it approved, because Underwood and Lodge were the keys to go into the Senate after the treaties were negotiated to really push for ratification. Now, there were some objections. In fact, William Borah, who's this was his idea in the first place, he was kind of bitter that he was not in the delegation, so he had some small groups that were opposed, but the collaboration between Underwood and Lodge in particular really made all the difference. Every one of the treaties negotiated at the Disarmament Conference were passed by the United States Senate. And again, perhaps a little bit of a lesson that Dr. Wilson, the PhD political scientist who was supposed to be the expert on government, maybe he could take a lesson from the harmonizer, Warren Harding, on how to get things done. A lot of praise for Harding coming out of this, including Elihu Root, who said something interesting, that I knew him very slightly at the time he was elected, and I was afraid he was going to be too anxious to please everybody. But he has shown himself to have a decision of character and cheerful courage that are most gratifying. That's Elihu Root. Reporter Mark Sullivan made this comment, that on this point of his capacity to stand on his own bottom, Harding was not merely underestimated, he was totally misapprehended. It was only a year ago that the phrase creature of a senatorial oligarchy was the epithet of the opposition party, supposed to be potent to deprive Harding of votes. Now, if that phrase is recalled at all, it is to point a joke on those who once believed it. Really making a name for himself within his country and as an international statesman for Warren Harding. Now, it's true the benefits of these treaties faded about a decade or so later, into the 1930s. Germany pushed to rearm in the wake of sort of the disastrous and the onerous elements of the Treaty of Versailles, and that changed the calculus in Europe. And the imperialists really took control in Japan starting around in the 1930s, so they started to rearm as these treaties came to an end. So they were not permanent. But Warren Harding did demonstrate that such agreements were possible. He initiated and completed the most significant arms reduction to date in world history, not only American history. And the fact that World War II came along was much more of an indication of the failures of the Treaty of Versailles than it was the treaties that Harding negotiated. And by the way, for this decade of not building ships, saved the United States a whole heck of a lot of money, as it did for other countries as well. Well, there were a couple of other post-war activities that Harding also tried to wrap up here in 1921. Again, those separate peace treaties were negotiated with Germany and the other Central Powers, so that mission was accomplished. The war officially came to an end. But there were still about 200 people in prison for wartime convictions in the United States from the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Now, most of the Allies had already let go these so-called political prisoners from their jails, but Harding wanted a case-by-case evaluation by his Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, before he would let them go, which he was inclined to do. He just wanted the cases looked at. The most famous was Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs is a former Union leader and a former presidential candidate several times for the Socialist Party of America. He had been convicted in June of 1918 of sedition and sent 10 years in prison. Woodrow Wilson, he was pushed to maybe consider commutation for Debs. No chance under Wilson. He considered him a traitor, never going to get him out. Well, Warren Harding thought it was time to look at Debs' conviction, and he had Harry Daugherty call him to Washington to talk about it. Now, Debs had been a model prisoner in prison, and frankly, Daugherty trusted him. He said, well, you don't need a guard, get on a train, come to D.C., let's talk about this. So that's what they did, and he came in early December of 1921 to talk about his conviction. They spent several hours together. The takeaway was Daugherty believed it was time to commute the sentence of Eugene Debs, and he recommended doing so by the end of the year. Warren Harding agreed with one exception. He said, why wait? I want him to spend his Christmas with his wife. Let's set the date of December the 24th. And he did. And it wasn't just Debs that got out. At this same point in December of 21, let out another couple of dozen prisoners who had been convicted under the Espionage or the Sedition Acts. By the next year, the number in prison for these acts was down to 62. By the following year, when Harding was about to go on his trip to Alaska, only 21 people were still in prison. This was all part of Harding's push on the return to normalcy in the United States. Now, one other item from the war, very popular after the Civil War with Republicans, were bonuses, basically pensions that would go to people who had fought in the war. It was very popular in Congress, very popular with the American public, and people wanted to do the same thing with the war veterans from World War I. A bonus bill had made its way through Congress, was heading to the desk of Warren Harding. Warren Harding said no. He brought out his veto pen. He basically said the country can't afford this. According to Harding, this menacing effort to expend billions in gratuities, we may rely on the sacrifices of patriotism in war, but today we face markets and the effects of supply and demand and the inexorable law of credits in time of peace. A modest offering to the millions of servicemen is a poor palliative to more millions who may be out of employment. Look, Harding was generous to a fault at times, but look, he had competing objectives here. Unemployment was more important. He wanted to use the coffers of the federal government as best he could, and it wasn't just to give out these gratuities. Congress tried to override the veto. They did in the House. Not quite in the Senate, and this one held. Look, these were bold decisions coming from the United States president, Warren Harding. He had demonstrated himself both a leader in his own country, a statesman around the world. He was fulfilling his promises on the return to normalcy in the post-war environment, both domestically and internationally. This was the story of the first year of Warren Harding when it came to international affairs on disarmament. From the life of Warren Harding. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.